One of the basic rules of journalism is that you report the news without fear or favor. People who follow politics in Florida know of a must-read news site whose publisher says he does not play by those rules. The news site is called Florida Politics, and on that site it can be hard to tell the difference between what's news and what's advertising.
I don't think I've ever held myself up as a journalist. I've said that I'm a publisher, that I publish the work of other journalists.
Peter Schorsch has built up a near mythic stature in state political circles.
He will determine whether or not something is news in the state of Florida.
He blamed me for her loss. That election didn't have anything to do with me.
Even so, we heard the same story from politicians running the gamut, from liberal Democrats to Republicans who favor former President Donald Trump or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Consultants, corporate interests, and lobbyists take out those ads too. Those who neglect to do so might suffer in Florida politics, either from negative coverage or none at all.
Welcome to Why Are We Like This, the podcast that treats Florida like the active crime scene it is. I'm your host, David Quinones, and I'm joined by our co-host, as always, Tomas Kennedy. Tomas, how are you?
I'm not even gonna get into it. It's a day.
It's a whole ass day.
Yeah.
It's a whole ass week.
Yeah,
and if I have Thomas on one side of my screen, that means that I have, of course, on the other, our other co-host, Gerald. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm bad. Same as everyone else.
Generally bad.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you want me to do? This is terrible.
There's only one story in the media right now. And there's only one thing that anybody is talking about. And that, of course, is the decline of journalistic standards in the state of Florida and political media, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We do not have time for news and notes this week, as we have a cavalcade of guests who are going to be helping us dive into this topic of a case file today. We are focusing on Florida politics. Some might say, hey, you guys talk about Florida politics every week. Sure, but this week we are talking about the specific part of the Florida media ecosystem that is the website, floridapolitics.com. The site was founded back in 2013 and is run by a conservative gadfly, Tampa political fixture, and Disney adult, Peter Schorsch. At first blush, it's a fairly straightforward news gathering operation. It has well-sourced professional reporters putting out daily outputs of pretty well-edited content. It has a bit of preoccupation with the comings and goings of key people in the lobbying or consulting world. It's also the go-to place for palace intrigue-style bullshit political stories about petty rivalries, rumors, scuttlebutt, but it's also the source of one of the worst-kept secrets in Florida media and politics, which is that, like many other less prominent digital media outlets that you've heard us talk about here on this show, FloridaPolitics.com is a bald-faced pay-for-play operation that does not disclose its financial interests. Last week, NPR and Floodlight collaborated on a report about FloridaPolitics.com, which bills itself as this Politico-style news organization operating in a gray area of journalistic ethics, taking money in exchange for coverage. Tomas, how would you, in your experience, describe what FloridaPolitics.com is to sort of level set for the listeners?
A pay-to-play blog with a very niche audience of, mostly grifter lobbyists.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. Have you ever been? Because you're a pretty prominent person in the realms of different Florida political circles. Have you ever been called out in it? Have you ever been like has your name ever graced the pages of Florida? Yeah. We should do a little disclosure. We should do a little disclosure here. I have a few bylines of my own up on Florida politics. I think you do too, right?
I've wrote I think 2 or 3 op-eds that they published. Hasn't been for a long time, but full disclosure, I swear to God, I didn't pay for them.
Me neither. I did not pay for them, and I was not paid either.
And I would never, ever. I would never pay for a placement anywhere, by the way, but especially not on Florida politics.
Gerald, like me, you've worked in newsrooms for a while. Mm-hmm. What strikes you as we were preparing and researching for this episode? What strikes you about this model that maybe isn't immediately obvious to somebody who isn't paying who might see this and just be like, oh well, Esserman Toyota pays for ads in the Miami Herald. How is that bad?
Right. So a lot of people here pay to play. And they say, well, the two things. One, even on like a morning show, you might see like the following segment was paid for by, I don't know, the vacuum company. And then they spend all the time talking about how wonderful this vacuum is and how it can clean your...
Blown by my vacuums from the vacuum
What's
company.
nefarious about that? They disclosed that they got sponsored and they showed a product. Okay. Problem is, not only is this guy passing off that type of stuff as journalism, he is alleged. Well, I mean, you know, a lot of people have come forward, but I'll just say allegedly. Not just engaging in pay to play, but pay to make it go away, which is there's something something specific about that.
Nice campaign you got there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is I want to try to like before we get to our guests, I want to like draw a line in the sand between this and some of the other pay for play operations that we've talked about here on this show in the past, where like they come with sort of a lot of the other ones come with a sort of ideological bent, right, Tomas, where they're pretty committed to right-wing causes, and it just kind of it helps that, you know, that they feel that way because they're also able to cash the attendant check for feeling that way. This is something different. This is a real, you know,
it's
a free agent.
Like hard news, not objective news. You know, they're basically pitching themselves as you know, the political alternative of Florida. Like political is in the website, you know.
Yeah. So before we get to our first guest, Miranda Green, who is the director of investigations over at Floodlight and who was the main byline on this story, what do you guys think? You think this could work for us? Should we embrace the pay to play model, or to pay to make it go away?
I pitched that we should have a GoFundMe to get us placed on the site and see how it goes. That's my pitch. I think. Let's see how much we can raise. It'd be fun.
I wouldn't donate to it.
We're now joined by Miranda Green, Director of Investigations at Floodlight, who shared the byline with NPR's David Folkenflik. And Floodlight's this nonprofit newsroom. It's very much kind of a new style of investigative reporting that we're seeing that's paying a lot of dividends, sort of similar, for those that don't know, to like the ProPublica type of model. And I'm just wondering, to kick things off, Miranda, how working for Floodlight, where the interest is in, you know, reporting on the powerful interests that are stalling climate action, how did this particular story about FloridaPolitics.com land on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, you would not necessarily think that they go hand in hand, right? When you think about climate change and then you think about a local Florida, you know, politics site. But actually, I spent almost an entire year last year working on a series of stories with both David Folkenflik and another colleague of mine, Mario Ariza, who's based in Florida, specifically looking at how utilities across both Florida and Alabama were using a consulting firm to basically manipulate the news. And they were doing that in a variety of ways. They were basically, you know, paying for coverage. They were also buying up newspapers themselves and determining their coverage. And then they were kind of relying on a lot of connections they had with the people who worked as publishers and editors and other kind of one-off online publications to kind of push messaging that worked for them, whether it be anti-solar messaging or specifically targeting politicians who were running on positions that were counter to what these utilities wanted. And so as we were digging into those stories, Florida politics came up a lot. And so we did include it a bit in our piece, but everyone we talked to said there's a lot more here than you realize. There's a lot going on with Peter Schorsch, and you should really give it its due. And so we decided at the time to kind of pull back on some of the reporting we had there and hold it for another day, which is what the culmination of the story is.
Yeah, I want to just ask you, you know, because I did a piece recently. I do a little bit of amateur journalism related to how these sort of like pay-to-play blogs have propagated in Florida. And there's so many on the right wing, right? There's one called Florida's Voice that, you know, we also got receipts of them basically taking payments to puff up these like right wing political campaigns, you know? But and I think I don't actually, it's not that I don't mind it, but, there's always going to be partisan and opinionated media. It is what it is, freedom of speech. But like, you have to disclose to your readers when you're being paid, right? Like that, I think is the sin here, that you're like misleading your readers while pushing an opinion for a special interest. But, something like Florida's Voice, it's like a very partisan right-wing blog, right? And David, when this story broke out, you had a great tweet or repost or whatever, where, because Peter, reacting to it, he said that, actually we do great journalism. We covered COVID and Florida politics from an objective, informational point of view. And David said, that's actually kind of like more insidious in a way, because he is like sort of masquerading this like pay-to-play content, right, for these special interest groups behind this veneer of just like objective, truthful, by-the-book journalism, right? So like, I don't know, like I just want to get your opinion on that. Like, do you have the same sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, you explained it. You explained it really well. I think the main issue here is that we are, we're in a new age of journalism. We have stepped far away from the days of local newspapers being print papers that were shown to your doorsteps. Not only is most of reporting and most news come to people online, but a lot of those local papers don't exist anymore. So people have really been left with an information vacuum. So not only that, we are now paired with anyone can create a newspaper online. Anyone can create anything on a website and call it news. So the question is, where's the distinction? What's the distinction between what someone calls news and what actually is news? And so when we were writing this story, especially, David is a media reporter, so this is something he's very interested in, but it's, when you look at what the news media says, there are a standard list of ethics that reporters have to abide by. There's a business side of every journalistic entity, but there's supposed to be a very solid wall between the money there and the coverage, and never the two shall meet. I mean, that is the standard, dream in journalism. That's kind of the gold standard. And yes, there are publications that skew to the left and skew to the right, but they still have that wall. They might, and they're open about their coverage. You're going to have a place like Fox News that's obviously catering towards, conservatives. And then you're going to have a place like The Nation, which is obviously catering towards liberals. And they're open about that. But they also label their stories when they're paid for by other people, because that is a standard practice. What we're seeing with Florida politics, and specifically in this story, is that he essentially is trying to do it both ways. He calls it, Peter Schorsch, the publisher who he spoke to extensively for this piece, got to speak to us on record, and he did a radio hit for us. He calls it combination journalism. And that's where you get into this really kind of gray
dystopian term. That is a truly dystopian.
Like you're getting two for one. Yeah.
Exactly. And, he is really, open about that. He basically says that this issue that, David and I were coming at this story from, which is saying, why don't you just label it? Why don't you just say where it comes from? And that kind of gets rid of a lot of this kind of gray area. And he said that's an issue for legacy media. That's not something that he thinks is a problem. But he kind of goes back and forth. He has hired reporters from legitimate news publications or reporters right out of college who really want to be journalists. I spoke to 5 of them for this story. They considered themselves real straight journalists, and all of them left because they didn't feel comfortable with what was going on ultimately at the end of the day. 4 of them told me that on multiple occasions that there was influence, that either they were specifically told stories to write, specifically told how to write them with talking points, or had their actual stories changed by Peter directly. One reporter told me on background that he had written a story and he had basically found out who was behind this dark money group that was part of a local campaign race. And when he wrote the story up and was really proud of himself for being able to follow the money, he was right out of college. And Peter said, remove the name of the guy, because the guy was a consultant, a well-known consultant, and he didn't want to have to kind of go that mile. That does not happen in standard journalism. And so, that is kind of the point of this story, is to highlight this kind of nuance where the readers of these stories think that these are legitimate stories. And some of them might be, but there's a lot of other pieces out there that are maybe written because they paid for him or because someone paid him to write them. Or there are other stories there that have been written in a certain way because they are advertisers.
Can you give us more examples like you just did, just so like the listener can have, the story colored in their mind and have a sense of what's happening with this coverage?
Yeah, I think that, Florida politics at its heart it's kind of, we likened it as to the Politico of Florida. And there is a Politico Florida, but we're thinking of like, it covers not just in a newsletter, but the day-to-day ins and outs of local Florida politics. And from an outsider outside of Florida, you might say, like, why does that matter? But Florida is a huge state. It's a very important state. There's so much going on with it on a daily basis in terms of politics.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but like just for the viewer understands the difference. I read Political Florida almost every day, and they actually do a lot of like pay-to-play pieces. The difference is that they'll have a piece.
It's very clearly,
a piece paid for by like Shell, right, the oil company, but it'll say, this is sponsored content paid by Shell. At least you know, like where it's coming from.
Yeah,
which is worthy of its own brand of criticism, but it's a separate and apples and oranges to what Florida politics
they call it sponsored content, right? I mean, that's what it is. But they clearly label that this article has been sponsored. We wrote this because we got money to write this. Yeah.
There's a. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No.
Go ahead. Continue telling us about the story. I just wanted the reader to know that because standard practice, but it's just crazy what Florida politics is doing.
Well, Tomas, you had brought up examples, right? And the example that we were talking about right before you joined us, Miranda, was that there was a time that I recently in our own group chat brought up this oddity of the publisher, Peter Schorsch, publishing back in April. What is tantamount to just a press release from Meta, from Facebook, about job creation and economic impact with no examination of like anything else about Meta and Facebook. And it took us a couple of days. I was like, why is the publisher of Florida Politics writing about this? Sure enough, banner ads and, skyscraper ads and then, other adjoining, types of sponsored material started showing up. And in your reporting, you talk about how these were packages that people that candidates, that representatives of organizations had arrayed to them. This was part of the media buy. Oh, you're going to get some positive coverage along with your standard, advertisement placement, right?
Exactly. And he promotes those. He usually reaches out to people he asks to buy. He has what I believe is a kind of text chain, and he texts them out to all of his advertisers or candidates or people who've bought with him in the past. And he says, here's the specials for the next month or the next quarter. Or sometimes he even reaches out when he's about to go on vacation. And he says, here are some deals. I'm going to go on a cruise. I've looked at these text messages myself, so I'm not really ad-libbing here. It's actually something he has asked. Or one recently said, no, actually, I'm not going on a cruise, but I am asking you to advertise. And
I was tickled by that. The one where he specifically is calling out, this is not for a cruise. I just need to close the quarter strong or something along those lines.
Yes. And so he does ask people to advertise. And in part of the package that he's, offers to them is something that's called native content. And so native content on its face is a very advertising term, but it means content that looks legitimate. And so in typical native content, when you hear that in your newspaper, it's content that looks legitimate, but your byline might say, as written by the candidate who's running, or, a line at the top saying like, this was paid for by Florida Crystals. Peter doesn't do that. Nothing on his website is labeled as paid for by anyone. And he has, told us in interviews when we've asked him about specific content that just looks straight up like it's sponsored content, or as you said, just republished press releases, that he does have them as subscribers, as advertisers. Florida Power and Light is one of them. He has told us that he routinely annually gets money from them as advertisers. Tampa Electric is another big one. We saw quite a few positive articles for them recently all across his website. But oftentimes a lot of his publishers are actually lobbyists, or they're big groups that represent like agricultural interests. And so it's really hard to find, who is benefiting from this coverage because it's coming from some of these kind of opaque groups. And so
it's very inscrutable sometimes. You have to do some research to figure out, like, why does this guy care so much about phosphor levels in water? But sure enough, if you do some digging and look at some of the archived advertisements and you can kind of piece together retroactively these sponsorship packages. You'd be like, oh, I see, they paid for this article with this headline and with this skyscraper ad.
It's not just like special interest groups, right? Because we live in a representative democracy and a lot of this stuff needs to be approved by the Florida legislature, right? Like the Florida Senate are the ones who, as we've covered extensively on this podcast, appoint the people who serve the public in this public service commission to regulate, or utility monopoly in the state. So it's all connected. And, we're going to have Eunic Ortiz in a little bit, who's a friend of mine, by the way. But he also does this like packages for candidates, political campaigns, and their consultants. So do you mind also talking about the electioneering aspect of this sort of like pay-to-play schemes that he runs?
Yeah, I mean, I will first say that it's not technically electioneering because it is technically legal under Florida law. But the
shows what you know, Tomas. We're so bad that it's legal. How's that crap?
Florida, baby.
I will say that most of the stuff I cover, with all these contents is it's questionable ethical behavior, but usually is technically legal. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's right? But it just means there's no law against it. And so the question actually with the candidates buying content and not being labeled is it's actually bad for the candidate. The candidate can be the one that can ultimately get in trouble here because there are a lot of election laws about labeling where their money is going, money they're getting from, PACs that are advertising on behalf of them or money they're getting directly donated from. And so on a federal level, there have actually been more stringent laws passed about like if you are publishing on an online news site, you have to label this is paid for by so-and-so for his campaign. But on a state level, Florida does not regulate that. And so that is kind of still a murky water that they're wading into. And maybe that will change, but at this point in time, it's not. But what's really interesting about the candidates that I have heard from most of the candidates I talked to, I mean, we had 3 candidates on the record tell us that they specifically were asked to or engaged in this kind of pay-to-play scheme. Some, saying that they felt like it was completely okay. Others saying that they felt uncomfortable with it, that they maybe engaged and then backed off of it after kind of learning more about what they were paying into. But when you look at the races that he weighs into, most of them are, state races, they're bigger names. A lot of the people who kind of flagged for me, this is how we knew that he was getting paid, was when he was paying attention to really small races. Mm-hmm. There was one race in particular that he paid attention to back in 2020 for the Tallahassee City Commission race, where it was a race.
This is with Jack Porter, right?
Is right, exactly. Yeah. Jack Porter was running, and she was, running on a progressive podium, and she was running against an incumbent, but the incumbent, Elaine Bryant, had actually been kind of appointed to her position. And Peter wrote under his byline a couple of columns that specifically were very positively Bryant and kind of alleged that Porter was racist because she was running against a person of color, and aren't liberals supposed to be supportive of people of color? And I did talk to Porter for this story, and she said that she thought that it was such a bizarre thing, and she wasn't even expecting Florida politics to cover the race because it was such a small race, and that she had never been reached out to for comment. The story was just completely written and, never had a say, wasn't asked to advertise, nothing. But what we were able to find looking at the donations is because candidates who pay directly, do have to show where their money is going for in their races, is that Elaine Bryant had paid a communications firm. Steve Van Cor runs the communications firm, and he's a very close friend of Peter Schorsch. And she paid him the day for digital media, the same day of Peter's second column, supporting her candidacy.
I was going to say politics also is pretty well situated for a model like this, because you were talking about, like, you talked to candidates who felt uncomfortable or had ethical qualms, but they might have also made the consideration that even if they feel that this is unethical, their opponent might not feel so, and could be putting themselves at a disadvantage if they didn't, cooperate and make the payment. I wanted to ask also, just because one thing that struck me about the article is how many people spoke to you on condition of anonymity. I wanted to ask if you've heard from any of your sources since the article has been released. Is there a sense of relief? Is there a sense of anxiety? Obviously you're pretty well insulated from bringing this to light, but for the people you talk to, like, obviously you're not naming any names, but if you have heard from anyone, what is their sense of the article? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, all the sources we talked to basically came out and said that they were really happy with, the story coming to light. We had a lot of people reach out to us and saying, this has been something people have been talking about for years, but you actually got the receipts, which was our goal in doing this story, and why we spent so much time trying to find, not weeding through not just the hearsay, but actually finding proof of this kind of accusation and that this is what was happening. I had a lot of other people reach out and say, oh, he did this to this campaign I ran, or he did this to this candidate, or he very clearly backs this company. But I will say that there's still an atmosphere of fear. A lot of the sources I talk to still don't feel comfortable going on the record, even though they now know that there's, other people who did, and that they are not alone. And that's because Florida politics is still a huge mouthpiece in the state. It is one of the only online papers or, publications that cover politics like this. And candidates and corporations still know they need it, because they need the clicks, they need the eyeballs, they want the coverage. And when they're running for campaigns, not only is it helpful to have those articles online, but they can then use them in their campaign mailers. Look at this incredible headline that I had written about me. And so it's kind of just part of the ecosystem of politics, and they know that it's not going away. So not only do they feel like they need Florida politics, but also Peter has a bit of angry streak. I mean, he is well known for attacking people online. He calls them out by name. He openly blocks them on Twitter. And so I just don't think that a lot of people have the wherewithal to go toe to toe with him, despite the fact that they know that they feel uncomfortable with his practices.
I worked in the state legislature, and this has been like Florida's worst kept secret for a long time. I commend you on your piece. I agree with the people that said that you got the receipts. I mean, look, when we read the piece and we decided to do this, I was like myself a little worried about doing this, because I work in the advocacy space. And yeah, like, he does have kind of like a streak for vendetta, and I think you actually retweeted this or reposted, whatever it's called these days. But he does like this segment. I think it's every week, that's called Florida Losers and Winners, and he put 3 individuals in this list with like threats, like snitches get stitches and other things that are like in reference of just like mafia talk, basically, with like slight violent language directed at these individuals on his blog after the story was published. That's crazy. I mean, what was your reaction when you saw that?
It's always interesting to see how the subjects you report on respond after your story comes out. I mean, we had months of conversation with Peter, on background and on the record. So I didn't think that he would be shocked by anything that came out in the story. But it was definitely, disheartening to see threats to anyone written anywhere. And he referenced mainstream media. I think he wrote like, they hate us because they ain't us, which is
sure.
Okay, fine. But then he listed the names of 2 former Florida politics reporters who he thinks talked to us for the story, and threatened. I mean, I would say that it's probably, my opinion is, it seems threatening. One of them was, I think, a quote from some sort of gangster movie. It was like, I know it was you, Fredo.
Yeah, The Godfather.
And then the other one was snitches get stitches, which is obviously a concerning thing to write, and to call out, these 2 people by name on a very well-known and well-read publication.
Also revelatory, right? Because you're acknowledging that they snitched on something.
Yeah, exactly. You're acknowledging that there is something that you've participated in with them for which they would want to or might potentially snitch. It's kind of telling on yourself a little bit more than anything.
Yeah. And I think that just the most interesting thing for me watching some of the kind of reaction to this story too is I saw so many people, Peter kind of did respond to it online and other people were tweeting about it and some were defending him and some were saying, I didn't know this was real. And I think it's always the everyday readers and their tweets that I find the most interesting because again, the insiders knew that this was pay to play. That's what we always heard. But it was the everyday readers just trying to stay in contact with what was going on in their state legislature who did not know this. Because nothing was labeled so, because they weren't being told that by the lobbyists on the inside. They weren't working out of Tallahassee. And someone tweeted to Peter in his defense, one of his kind of I will comment on this later tweets and said, Peter, why don't you just label this as it is? Why don't you just label the stories when they are paid by other people?
Because that's giving up the ghost. That is, and I want to thank you, Miranda, for joining us. We're going to talk to Eunic next, but that is giving up the ghost. That is in an era where like everybody is figuring out, what kind of norms can we just throw out without breaking the law? Do you think that the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel and the Orlando Sentinel and the Democrat couldn't have just done something like this and made money? Of course, they could have just been unethical. They could have just done this, but there's a reason that it's not against the law, but it's against their bylines because it's the wrong way to do business in journalism. And what scares me is how in your reporting, you mentioned the fact that the business model so far is successful. He is making money, and it looks like he has his eyes outside of outside of Florida into the rest of the southeast of the U.S. And we really appreciate your reporting. It was a very insightful and interesting article.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate you for having me and reading.
We're now joined by Eunic Epstein-Ortiz, a political strategist, EVP of Communications at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And she's quoted at length in this investigation that we've been talking about the experience of being a communicator in the world of Florida politics, being a candidate in the world of Florida politics, and having to deal with the outlet, Florida politics. So welcome, Eunic. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start with your recent run for the seat and your decision to purchase, the way that the article begins, your decision to purchase an ad package from Florida politics. So you did that because you kind of were advised like, hey, this is the thing to do. You're going to run for office in Florida. This is where you kind of get the attention of the movers and shakers. And so you did. Walk us through what happened after that.
Sure. And it wasn't just I think it's the worst kept secret in Florida politics that the website Florida Politics requires you to pay for positive coverage. I experienced that when in a previous role I was running campaigns of targeting, trying to turn out infrequent voters in communities of color. And we had a number of positive articles written by Florida Politics, which was great. We were getting coverage of what we were doing. And the follow-up I got directly from Peter by email was inquiring after a few of those articles ran, hey, would you like to buy one of my ad packages? And I was like, well, I don't think infrequent disengaged voters in communities of color read floridapolitics.com, so that wouldn't make sense for our campaign. But thank you so much for reaching out. And his response was, well, that's not how it works. And I will never forget that exchange in 2018. So fast forward to 2021, when I launched my campaign for state Senate, I was very well aware of the ad model and the business model that Florida Politics runs. I don't think Peter is shy about the business he is running. The problem I have with it is twofold. One, he writes articles and writes stories that have just blatant misinformation in them. And the reporters there was a number of reporters who spoke on anonymity in the piece that was run by NPR that said that they were encouraged to run the same business model and run stories and what looked like news and journalism that had misinformation and disinformation in it. Why? because people are going to come to you and say, hey, why are you writing something about me that's not true? Why are you misrepresenting me as a candidate in my case, in my personal case? And we asked, and the response we got was, well, don't you want to talk to folks in Tallahassee? Don't you want to talk to some of these lobbyists? And the answer was, in our case, well, you know what? Let's try to work with Florida politics, because at this point, which I think candidates across the state, across every county face this every election cycle, how can you get in front of the folks to make sure your name is out there, to make sure you are a credible candidate? Because sadly, the way our electoral system is run, it's not good enough that you have someone who wants to do the work and you have good ideas. You have to now play this game, even though really what it should be about is your constituents voting for you. And he has built this model on the backs of not following FCC and FEC regulations to say, hey, this article was paid for by this candidates committee. He runs this model because he's making money and making ad dollars, as he said himself, millions of dollars a year, by getting ads bought for, so that way he can run the articles he wants to run in the way he wants to run them. So back to your original question, which was how it came about, I'll never forget. First article that came out misstated what I fundraised. Said the number I fundraised was not the number I fundraised. Second article that came out misstated what I fundraised. And I started to see in the conversations I was having with folks saying, hey, are you doing okay? Is your campaign okay? And it sounds small, but when you're running for office, those things matter. And what he has built is an entity that is okay running lies. That way he can make money to run the truth. When in fact, as a publisher, as he likes to call himself, I don't care if it's a publisher, a journalist, or anything else, if you're going to post something online, have it be the truth.
Yeah, I want to sidebar that, because to a lot of people listening, they might think okay, well, you know what? I open the Miami Herald every day and they get facts wrong. It's not that. There's a difference between what we call in the industry a set rec, a correction, having to run I got this number wrong, and purposely adjusting and framing things to make it be the candidate who didn't pay me, flagging campaign, not doing good, not looking good,
Basically, let's be honest, to shake down a candidate.
Right. It's an entreaty for a sales pitch, because it sounds like you got your request. I'm trying to imagine in my head during my time as a reporter at the Miami Herald, whether if somebody called me for a correction because I'd made a mistake in their article, that I pitched them advertising, and it seems so discordant to the idea of what journalism should be. And not trying to sound all high and mighty about journalism or whatever, but that's really egregious. But it seems like that's become sort of the state of play for folks like yourself. It must be concerning, because if you're progressive, if you're on the left, if you're liberal, if you're Democratic, people don't like to talk about this that much, but you're usually outspent and you're outgunned in money. So while he positions himself as being this sort of above the fray, above the partisan politics, it's well, you're still kind of lending yourself to whoever has the money to pay you, right? I mean, there's still that gravity.
Yeah, and look, there are very few, and by very few, I mean one issue in the state of Florida that Republicans and Democrats can agree on, and it's the fact that this sort of business model Peter has been running has got to go. You see a lot of Republicans in that story by NPR speaking out. Rep. Ana Escamani also spoke out on the Democratic side. You have sitting electeds, you have folks speaking on anonymity, and frankly, you have folks speaking on anonymity because they're afraid of the backlash, right? I have said this several times. Peter is not the reason why people win and lose election. Peter is not the reason why policy gets passed or not, but there is an influence there. There's an influence in trying to set a tone and a narrative, or trying to shame folks, that's going to make it increasingly harder. And let's take away the fact of writing fake or truth or whatever he does to make his millions, as he has undisclosed in this article. There are rules when you run for office as a publisher, that if someone is giving you money to run what is considered to be an ad, you have to have a disclaimer. That is a violation of federal law, no matter what level of office you are running for. to not have that disclaimer.
Yeah, Eunic, I want to follow up on that, actually, if you don't mind. And I don't think you mind because you just stated it and you also tweeted about this. But yeah, he is in violation of FEC laws, FEC regulations. Like, what can happen here? Like, can there be some sort of consequence to Florida politics for engaging these sort of like, pay-to-play schemes?
Nationally, we're seeing, not FEC, but nationally we're seeing a crackdown on mis and disinformation online, right? That is separate from what Florida politics is conducting. And right, folks posting on social media deep fakes of Joe Biden or Trump saying something they never said. That's one piece of this. This is something so niche that it's going to take the will of that federal agency to lean in here and start investigating. And I think by NPR writing on this, 10 years ago, the Tampa Bay Times did a very in-depth investigation on this business model. By you guys talking about it, by folks continuing to talk about it, it might bring to light and might bring urgency by FEC to lean in here and say, you know what, let's look at the books. Because if he is self-disclosing that he has made millions of dollars off this business model, and then what you're seeing on his website is the same 3 static ads that are always showed, where's that money coming from? And then you go online, you go to the public records, you don't see any of these candidates saying that they bought ads with his site.
Also,
because they all go to different entities.
Also, knowing like how, like you wouldn't know, like I think a lot of people wouldn't know it, but a lot of journalists are not just like underpaid, but they're overworked. Like they have a lot of deadlines to meet, especially with the attention economy, the way that it is now. You're always hungry for content to have to, post out to your audience. So when someone approaches you with a statewide labor campaign and a site is able to say, we're taking a pass on that, that kind of opens the doors to, you must have a lot of other stories that you're working on to be able to take a pass on a story that's basically you're being approached with, or the engagement is not what's driving the revenue.
Yeah, I don't think he gets a ton of eyeballs on his site. I think the eyeballs on his site he gets is...
Thank you. Oh my God. I feel like this is something we've been running around when we talk about this website, is that it is influential within a tiny pool of very wealthy, mostly white guys.
100%. And again, he does not decide anything in the state of Florida. But for some reason, he's created this business model that is breaking federal law and is continuing to do so, that is putting the fear. And my concern, I don't care about the folks who are huge lobbyists, make a lot of money, and this is like a drop in the bucket in their ad buy every year, right? You have lobbying firms, you have corporations, and you have very, statewide, countywide, and even state elected officials say, here's my check. I'm not concerned about them. They got God's money. I'm concerned about the everyday candidate who's trying to break through in Pinellas County, Hillsborough, Pasco, Orange, down in Miami, the everyday person who wants a fair shot at getting quality journalistic coverage of what they're trying to do. Because what happens is you have a site like this that is attacking those folks or not covering them or misleading and misrepresenting them. And then the cards are immediately stacked against them. We need quality people running for office, not just the same old folks running every single time. And you're only going to get there because earned media is one part of it. And I'll give you a great example. Richie Floyd in St. Pete, 2021. He ran openly as a member of the DSA in Pinellas County. And he won, miles, like whooped his opponent because he had a very, very key organizing strategy. He was knocking on doors for over a year, every single day, every single week. Ask me if Florida politics ever covered that campaign.
Yeah, of course not.
I think it was a footnote in like winners and losers after the election was over that like, oh yeah, this like random kid won.
Yeah. But meanwhile, we're just talking about it with Miranda. He like zeroed in, on Jack Porter in Tallahassee and just, tried to like derail her campaign at every single, turn. It's because he was getting paid by all these like Tallahassee insiders that want to derail her and Jeremy Matlow on behalf of, John Daly and that constellation of people.
He would say to you, Eunic, and based on the way that he is presenting himself in this article, he would say, ask me if I covered that race. Well, ask me if the kid cut a check. And it seems there's been 3 or 4 times in our short conversation where you've said something where I almost wanted to, the journalist inside of me wanted to pipe in and say, allegedly. And then I remember, like, no, it's not allegedly. It's him saying it. He's saying that he's doing these
He's literally, if you look at all of the coverage, he's already putting it out there. None of us need to break this news. He's already putting it out there. And that's why I keep calling it the worst kept secret in Florida politics. It's very well known. I mean, Richie did not get a check. It's clear by the coverage he got. And look at any of these other races across the state. We have a special election in HD 35. I'm looking at his website right now. Tell me where I can find information about that.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, look, at the end of the day, I would love a website with journalistic integrity that covers the nuances of Tallahassee and every county and city commission in the state of Florida. We need that. Because local news doesn't have the capacity to cover that. People need to understand the news they're getting. But the fact is anything you read on the site is going to have a slant. And that's why every single story on the site has to have a disclaimer per federal law that says brought to you by.
Eunic, I wanted to ask you also, because I think you're really brave by coming in and talking about this and talking to Miranda. Just talking about your experience. As I told Miranda right before you came in, I was like worried myself to talk about this, to be honest. And I'm, we've known each other for a while. I'm usually like a pretty fearless person, to be honest, not to toot my own horn, but I don't scare easy. And I was worried about talking about this because, he is like a kind of a petty person with a mean streak. Have you have you talked to other candidates, without naming any names, of course, about this, that have experienced something similar as you, and what has been their reaction, if so?
Yeah, there's a really, really cool thing that happens when you run for office, and that's the community you create, not only here locally, I'm in Pinellas County, but across the state, and you get to meet other candidates. I have not met a single candidate in this state from 2021 into 2022 that wasn't at least pressured into doing this. Now, imagine the number of people who registered to run for office, and let's take away 30%, and then multiply that number by anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 or more, depending on their level of office.
So much money. The amount of money that's going through.
You kind of touch on something that I want to discuss here. And again, we don't have to name names if you're uncomfortable with that. But there's like sort of like a consultancy like pipeline to paying for this coverage, right? So from your experience or from what you have observed, is this consultancy pipeline advising this because of like just a strategic imperative of just like we have to get this good coverage so we can, show that we're fundraising and we can get, lobbyists and donor groups to give us money? Or are they like in cahoots with him and they're getting like a kickback, or is it a mixture of both? Like, what have you observed?
You think Peter's sharing his money? I mean, come on now. The man gloats about
those Disney cruises are expensive.
Yeah, exactly. The man gloats about his cruises, his rental property on the water, right? Like he just doesn't, like I would be very surprised. I do think, to your former point though, like when something continues to happen, it's like you don't fight it, you just go with it because you're just trying to move the ball forward. And I sympathize with candidates all over the state where you just look at it and you say, how am I going to overcome this normalcy that has been this way for 10, 15 years, however long the site's been around? Guess what? That's one of the reasons why I spoke out, because I was like, you know what, Peter, that website's inconsequential to me.
That brings up a good point, though. I would love to ask you to take off your politics and candidate hat and put on your comms hat, because you're a comms person like I am, and advising an organization, like, is there ROI in, like, is there practically ROI in engaging in this? Like, does it make sense to actually pay the bounty or pay the ransom and
that's return on investment for sure.
Like
listeners, yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Well, in communications they always are like, okay, well, you asked us to spend $10,000 a month on Facebook last year and we didn't get any ROI. Oh, you had us spending targeted ads on this website and we did get ROI. And I just wonder, does it work, or is it more like a troll toll that you have to pay in order to even play the game?
I think it's, to Tomas's point, it's like the fear of the negative backlash from not doing it, and the continued negative and misinformation coverage you would get versus anything positive you would get out of it. Yeah, you get a link, right? I mean, I had hundreds of thousands of people on my email list. I would send it out. You get what, a 1% click-through rate, right? Like that's just the normal standard, the normal standard metric. But that's not worth it to me, right? If I was looking at an ad model and the ROI I get from Florida politics is something like NBC News would say, hey, here's the ROI we anticipate you get, I would say that's not worth my money. But I'm also not fearful of NBC News coming after me.
That they're going to turn their guns on you.
They're going to start putting their own money behind articles that lie about you, right? And, in this case, he was misrepresenting and lying in articles and not fixing it when we asked him to. So Florida politics, writing misinformation and lies, that's what I've heard largely from candidates across the state as to why they feel like they need to buy an ad package. No one is tracking the ROI of these static ads. No one is getting, and honestly, he doesn't even provide that information back to you. And I wouldn't even believe him if he tried to tell me how many people clicked through, because I would just assume he's lying. So, for me, it's not what's the ROI I'm getting from this? It's how can I mitigate the lies that will be written about me?
Yeah, and just wrapping up, because you know a lot of people work in politics and in advocacy in Florida. Similar to the last question, have people reached out to you, both congratulating you, but also saying like, I'm considering continuing to spend money on this website?
So when the NPR story came out, no one reached out saying that, oh, how could you have done this? I had an overwhelming response of people saying, finally, someone's talking about this. But those same folks are not willing to speak either, and I don't blame them, right? I think when people start to realize that the influence we give Florida politics is literally ours to control, and something we can really not give this guy any level of any influence over the state and how our politics runs. The other type of folks that reached out were candidates who are currently running for office, asking me my advice. Should I pay him the money? And my advice was clear. I said, you know what? You're going to end up spending $5, $10, $20, $30,000 depending on your seat. Could you go use that money somewhere else? Could you go get it's a lot of money for a small candidate, right? And then the third type of outreach that I got from folks when this article dropped was, wow, I can't believe you actually said something. Has he reached out to you? And I had a couple people ask me that. And my response was, he knows better than to call me.
Eunic, thank you so much for joining us, and more than that, thank you for hooking up with NPR and Floodlight and being sort of the lead person who was unafraid to. And by the way, no shade to the people who are staying off the record. I get it, man. You got a career. If you're young, it's tough. Eunic is kind of like a pretty established, very well respected person here in Florida. So like, it would take a lot for a guy like Peter Schorsch or that organization to knock her off her block. But I get it. But still, we do need folks like you, and thank you so much for being a voice to tell to tattle on the worst secret held in Florida media, Florida politics.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, no shade to anybody else. We get it, but mad respect to you, Eunic.
And to all the folks who are well established in the state, there are plenty of us, and thank you so much for the kind words, David. But there are plenty of folks who are well established, and reach out when you're ready to speak up, because it's going to just take a couple of us to make sure that we can stop this trend and we can really have a transparent and a process full of integrity that doesn't include a website like this.
Yeah, and at this point, to be honest, just before we close, what else is there to speak out on, right? I mean, the article's written and Peter is admitting to everything basically and kind of unapologetic. So at this point, it's just like, just don't spend money on this crappy website. Like,